Howdy, partner. With Poland news and foreign policy matters. To understand global affairs and foreign policy, it is critical to listen to actual experts and not the makeup-caked teleprompter readers that litter mainstream media. So today it is my privilege to have a very special guest, author, filmmaker, expert geopolitical analyst, a man with an encyclopedic knowledge of geopolitics and a computer-like recollection of historical facts. And despite being a young man, he already has decades of experience in foreign policy matters, over 20 years. Ryan Dawson, founder of ANC Report. That's short for Anti-Neocon Report. Welcome, Ryan. Can you please tell us about your background related to foreign policy matters?
Well, sure. First of all, thanks for having me on this show. I don't often get to talk to a Polish audience. And I think for some of the millennials, you might have to explain what an encyclopedia is. They just know Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Britannica is lost. But yeah, I have been accused of that. I guess, talk too much sometimes when it gets into intricacies of foreign policy. But I think details matter, so someone has to.
They sure do. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been at this for a long time. I guess I'm more well known for the documentaries I've made, one in particular on September 11th. But I did used to work for an FBI translator, Sybil Edmonds, as a geopolitical analyst. And I got that from accurately describing what's happening, predicting things like the 7/7 bombing and conflict in Ukraine, the Iraq War, etc. Went down exactly as I said it would and when I said it would. And there's no crystal ball or anything. It's just about understanding business interests and looking at the world. And just recently, on Halloween of this year, we said, Andrew Illingworth, another analyst, was on my show, and we said that there would be an upstart at the Strait for entering the Black Sea and through Ukraine, and they'd use this as a pretext against Russia, and that's exactly what happened. So.
Yep.
And, I've been on pretty regular guests on Russia Today, Press TV. I've been a token guest on some of the three-letter networks in the United States, like CNN and, well, I guess MSNBC is, or NBC, excuse me, I call them NPC a little bit, and the Jon Stewart show a couple times. Never as a full-on guest, though. They just take clips of mine. And they edit what I say, so I quit giving them interviews. If Tucker ever asked me on, though, I'd probably do it. He seems to be a bit more fair, but usually I'm sticking to the foreign press, and I've been on some Japanese media as well, but I think people more or less know me more from my own work that I produce and put in films and do as podcasts and pretty much daily videos on YouTube. So that sort of sums up foreign policy. I guess I would specialize mostly in the Middle East recently, but not limited to that. Pretty well known in the Israeli-Palestine conflict in those circles.
Oh yeah.
You got a lot of journalists shy away from that because there are a lot of consequences if you don't uphold the Zionist side. As this CNN employee recently found out, who was fired for standing up for the BDS movement.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. The Mont Hill.
That's right.
Yep. And, a lot of people self-censor because they know what you can and can't say on the three-letter networks. And when it comes to Zionism, I mean, this is why the U.S. has its imperial escapades, spending over $6 trillion in the Middle East, toppling Saddam, topping Gaddafi. And, what has resulted in that? You had years of sectarian violence in Iraq. This is all following 800,000 children being starved to death by sanctions, not to mention the first Gulf War. And then in Libya, with Gaddafi gone, the cork's undone, and you have all these refugees and migrants in Europe. And it's just been a cascade of problems. But America is not involved in these wars for American interests. They're there because of Zionist influence over American foreign policy. That's why there's sanctions on Iran. That's why they not so covertly aided ISIS in Syria, and then Jabhat al-Nusra, etc. That's why they are currently financing and arming the MEK in Iran to try and kickstart one there. It's not in America's interest to do any of these things. We have a parasite, but if you call a spade, you'll get accused of anti-Semitism or some other canard, and seems to be the only defense they have is, social justice warrior virtue signaling nonsense. And it is nonsense. I mean, criticizing Saudi Arabia is not anti-Arab. Criticizing North Korea is not anti-Asian. And criticizing Israel is not anti-Jewish. But people will try and paint it like that. And I think that everyone's a Nazi motif is starting to wear itself out.
Yep, I hear what you're saying. And speaking of Zionism and the U.S., where would you say the U.S. empire is on the bell-shaped curve in terms of its power and influence? Has it reached its peak?
Well, I would say you have to unpack what U.S. empire means, because the U.S. empire, although it is the U.S. military and U.S. mercenaries doing a lot of the legwork, along with a lot of proxy forces, the driving force behind this is a conglomeration of a lot of multinational corporations and institutions that don't really owe loyalty to any particular piece of dirt. They just see parasites flock to the strongest host, which is the United States. But many of these multinational companies, like BAE Systems, is British, and it gets usually fourth or fifth place in defense contracts from the Pentagon. Lockheed Martin jointly builds projects in Israel, like the F-35, which they spent $1.5 trillion developing, and another $1 trillion actually selling planes. There's no clear division between America and many other places. It's more of a class thing where corporate welfare leeches are using the military-industrial complex of multiple nations to profiteer. And America is definitely the largest one, but certainly not the only one engaged in this gambit. And there's a lot of overlap with quote-unquote allies. And that's the real empire. That's the one that's causing all the suffering. And it may be America-centric, but it isn't really anything from the 50 states, if you know what I'm saying. These are just jointly built profiteering corporate conglomerates that really have no head. It's not shaped like a pyramid. It's more like a headless, spider web or something with lots of nodes everywhere. And they use energy politics, weapon politics, narco politics, pharmaceutical politics. They're not one specific industry. When the I in MIC, it's not just the military, because the military is a large umbrella corporation for a slew of other industries like big pharma, like big oil, like illegal pharmaceuticals as well, that serve the purpose of black market budgets for the CIA, intelligence agencies, and using sabotage and force to manipulate economic agreements and the direction of whole nation states in some cases. And so I see this more of as a multinational problem. But if on the base level, if not digging too deep, yes, it's the American military that by far has the largest threat of force, the biggest stick that they can wave around, and they have the largest economy. So they can wage and use economic leverage as well as the threat of military force to coerce nations to capitulate to their demands. But these demands are not in the interest of U.S. citizens. It's not improving the quality of their life. These are in the interest of corporate fat cats and what is really mercantilism, which is really started with the tyrant Abe Lincoln and his terrorists.
Okay, I know you've touched upon it already a little bit, and I kind of skipped over, but if you could define what you would say is exactly the U.S. empire, and where would you say Poland fits in on the global chessboard? Is Poland just a pawn of the U.S. empire?
Poland's not just a pawn, but Poland stands up for itself when it comes to the EU, for example, and this migrant crisis, for example. They're saying, no, we've had enough. I mean, they have enough. There's sovereignty in Poland to enough degree, and they're one of the few states in Europe to do this, but not the only one. to understand that you can't just import the third world, that you're not really bringing them up. All you're doing is relocating poverty from one area to another. If people don't have the skill sets and et cetera that they need, and ideologies as well, and philosophies and economic and work ethic and a combination of things to be successful, they won't be successful. You can't just bring them to a successful area and expect everything to magically change. You're just draining the social system of the area that they're relocated to, and then this stuff is all convoluted and made difficult to talk about because people will bring up nonsense about race and xenophobia and all this irrelevant, conversation to muddy the waters, to act like opposing third world migration is somehow only motivated by, race, ethnicity, religion, whatever, and not, the economic interest and cultural integrity of your nation, your language, your folk. That, it's got nothing to do with, you could have two, even if it was the same language. If you have different cultures, it's different cultures, and every nation has the right to define its borders, and every nation has the right of sovereignty of its people and its way of life and ideology, and that is not tied to biology. It's tied to geography. And Poland has stood up for itself in that sense. On the other hand, though, with America doesn't really care whether or not Poland has immigrants or not. America's interest in Poland is it physically being close enough to Russia to threaten them with radar and a defense shield. And the pretext of putting in the recent, I don't think they have THAAD, but they have or maybe they do now actually, they have a missile defense shield, anyway, the classic one, where the claim was, we have to put this in Poland to defend it from Iran.
Right.
And everybody knows it's to threaten Russia.
Now, a lot of people who try to justify putting that shield up in Poland say, well, there's nothing to worry about for Russia because this is purely defensive. But I have heard a couple of analysts mention that those systems can be easily converted to offensive weapons.
Well, the radar is already penetrating space, right? The radar for the quote-unquote defense is voyeuristic. Like, you're already lighting up their grid and seeing where their offensive positions are, etc. Russia's not going to invade Poland anyway. This is just a boogeyman to use in order to justify lucrative budgets on useless stuff, like putting a defense shield in Poland. It's like, well, let's put a defense shield in Ireland to defend them from Britain or something. Let's put one in Canada just in case. It's pointless. Like, the idea of a Russian invasion of Poland today is like Japan reinvading China. Like, it's not going to happen. That's not why they really put these things here. But it does appear that NATO does want to kick off a hot conflict with Russia in Ukraine. And so they want to shore up and surround Russia with enough missiles, bases, radar, etc., to force their hand so that non-lethal means can be done. Like, they did not want to lose Crimea, for example. And there's a battle going on for what's called the Maritime Silk Road, which includes the Black Sea and the Strait of Azov. It includes the certain choking points. You've got the Strait of Hormuz, you've got the Red Sea, you've got the Suez Canal on one end, and the Aden Strait on the other. And then there's the Panama Canal. There's certain pathways on maritime trade. And then if you can control it, you can set yourself up as a very handsome middleman as a gateway. And everyone understands the sea traffic. One of the other and only remaining Russian base on the Mediterranean is, guess where? Syria. And you've seen Russian fighting tooth and nail to keep that and to protect Syria, but not only for Syrian interests, it's for Russia's own interests. They don't need a Sunni corridor connecting all the way up to the Chechens, which they'll have to deal with in their own nation. And I don't blame them. And you can see the allies, but don't act like it's some altruistic thing on behalf of Syria. This is in Russian interest, and there's nothing wrong with that either. Syria doesn't care why they're helping. They just accept the help, of course. But Poland is seeing it as like, well, the Americans, there's bribery involved. Like, if we accept this defense shield, I mean, it's America's money. They're the ones paying for it, the majority of all of these matters. And they're going to put them here, and they're going to get them in here anyway. So we might as well accept the highest offer, Alexander the Great style, before they bully us around, because Poland cannot compete with America on any level, with economy, with military, with trade, with leverage, with anything. They're really stuck. And so on that level, they're a pawn. But it's not like they would allow anything. They wouldn't allow any American troops to occupy Poland or anything crazy. But they will put the bases there. And that's sort of the standard ankle grabbing that America forces all Eastern European nations to do, just to surround Russia, because you have these neocon hawks that fantasize about the Cold War and how glorious that was to justify budgetary spending in the trillions. And they'd love to restart it. They love the Russophobia. They don't actually want to go to war with Russia. That would be mutual destruction. They just want you to think that we might go to war with Russia so that they can build more toys. And it works for them. And the war on terrorism really replaced the Cold War. Now they're trying to have both, but the war on terrorism, because Russia is an ally. And, Russia helped the United States in both world wars. And they should have been seen as an ally, but there's really not much else to point to that can scare Americans. So it's the evil Russians, maybe the evil Chinese, trying to use Iran or Libya or something to just they just laugh, right? So, but Russia's a threat to the entire order because it's a civic nationalist state, and they don't want that. They can't stand nationalism. But it seems from recent news in France especially, and seeing the yellow vest pop up in Quebec and Brussels and other areas, Italy, France, nationalism is on the rise. And really, way before France, Poland and Holland and the Italians, they started this. France was much more theatric about it. But, this nationalist fever has been spreading, and Poland has always had a leadership role in that because they never capitulated in the first place. And bowing to the U.S. is no shame. It's what else are they supposed to do? But they drew a line in the sand and said, we're not accepting all these policies. We're not letting the third world take over our country. And you can call us racist. You can call us names. We're not, we don't care. This isn't Sweden. We're going to stick up for ourselves. And good on them. Poland suffered enough in the history of this. You can't victim card Poland because they've been the victims. So they're not going to listen to that.
Yep. And just kind of going back to Poland, Russia, Poland has been on the bandwagon regarding all Russian aggression and are beefing up military assets, including what we talked about, the missile defense shield, as well as a proposed U.S. military base in Poland, which was recently dubbed for Trump when the president of Poland met with Donald Trump in Washington a couple months ago. Do you think that this buildup of military assets makes Poland more secure or more of a target in the event of a conflict between NATO and Russia?
If you rewind when the Polish president met with the Georgian president in 2008, after the South Ossetia affair, let's call it, and it was so over the top nonsense propaganda where one time they randomly stopped at night and got out of their car because they heard shooting. It's like, oh yeah, let's get two heads of state in a vehicle in the middle of the night, go to the border of a war zone, hear shots, and then stop and get out of the car. Right? It was completely staged, and it just looked terrible. And I remember reporting on RT for that, of all things. And yeah, this was back when RT was just getting going as well. There's anti-Russian sentiment, and you can kind of understand why. I mean, there are a whole generation of Poles that had to live through the Soviet Union and communism, and they probably resentful. I don't blame them. But this isn't the Soviet Union. It's not the same as when they were kids or whatever. And but it's not something that just washes away quickly. And it's enticing because if you play ball with the Americans, there are rewards short term. And a lot of politicians will take to that. But at least Poland is not at the point of completely selling their country down the river. They're just feeling like, well, maybe we don't like Americans, but Russia's worse. So they want a little bit of revenge. They don't mind signing on and taking the perks that come with the trade advantages with the United States. It's called soft power politics, and it is being engaged in Poland. But you better, be careful who you lie with, because all of these come with strings attached. And what are you going to do if Russia does invade? That little base and that little defense shield isn't going to matter at all. It's window dressing, and they know it, but it does involve a lot of personal profits for the Polish MIC to sort of piggyback on the American MIC, and they figure there's not going to be a war. We'll make some money. We get some cool guns. No harm done other than a huge waste of taxes.
Right. Let me ask you next.
That's how I think they think. I don't know, but that's what I see.
Sure. Yeah, but your analysis.
Usually I'm correct.
Yeah, I've noticed that your analysis has been pretty much spot on. As you said, you did predict some of the occurrences that happened, for instance, regarding Ukraine. So
what's interesting is that very last video I ever did on Vimeo was about Ukraine, and how if you want to see something slide into chaos, this is how it would happen. It was sort of a what if thing. I'm like, well, it would have to be through the Navy, and it's going to involve these straits, and we explained why and all that. And then the very first video I put on Gumroad was the very last video I put on Vimeo, right? The most recent thing I had done. And within a day, I was kicked off Gumroad too. And then I thought, what did I say that is so, I've been on Vimeo for 6 years. Why all of a sudden? And I assumed, it's got to be Israel. It always is. And the official pretext I was given was saying, my criticism of Israel basically got conflated with anti-Semitism, which is just silly. But then I start thinking, well, both companies, it was that Ukraine video, it was immediately after that. And then within a few weeks, almost exactly, we said a ship, they sent 3 ships. Okay. But, the point was the same, that they would send warships through the strait. And that's what they did. They sent a tugboat and 2 artillery ships. And down to the letter. And if you go and listen to that podcast, it does get worse. And I'd love to be wrong, but I don't think I am. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said it. Within weeks of explaining this, it happened. And I can see certain red flags now even, and it doesn't look very good. It's not irreversible yet, but if I can't get my voice out there, because it reverberates, other people repeat what I say, and we need to cool things down in Ukraine. I don't think a lot of people see the severity of it. They think, Ukraine, they've been fighting for a while there in Donetsk and da-da-da-da.
Yep.
No, this is different. Bolton and these neocons have an agenda. And we can talk about China later because he just sabotaged that too. But they are way crazier than people realize. To the point of nuclear war. And
that's a scary one.
Which what Russia would have to do, because it cannot take on the United States without using nukes. So we already explained the worst case scenario in that podcast. I'm not saying the worst case is going to be the case, but we're on the path. The beginning portion has already happened and started. The reaction to it is also exactly like we said. So we need to turn this ship around, literally. We cannot allow NATO, as they're talking about now, sending boats through the strait. You commandeered these 3 Ukrainian ships, which weren't like coffee ships or something. These are military vessels. Why do you need, if NATO is seriously talking about doing that in a provocation and they think Russia's going to yield, they're wrong. They will get blown out of the water. They're not going to give up their front yard. And, it's a game of chicken. If you know the game of chicken. And they think they'll move, and they're not going to move. And this is how you sort of stumble into unintended conflict, serious physical war. Because they think, they'll move. They always move. They kept moving. NATO's been expanding eastward, even though they, at their creation said they weren't. More and more and more. The line is drawn at Crimea, and you're not moving another inch towards Russia.
Yeah, I think has made it very clear that the red lines are Georgia and Ukraine. So
yeah, the whole circumference. They're not letting you in. And what's telling, it seems unrelated, but it isn't, is Putin has been warming up to Japan, even offering them for these islands that Russia took during World War II.
That's right. That was recent too.
And that's always been a big bargaining chip because you've had many decades to return those. You're not doing anything with them, but Japan certainly needs land and wants these islands. They were Japanese traditionally, but look, anyway, I'm not going to get into island disputes because they have them with China, they have them with Korea, they have them with Russia. On that one, I happen to agree that they were traditionally Japanese islands, but the northernmost ones have Russians living on them, so they're not going to be going anywhere. But he offered them the southern island chains. And so why now suddenly is he giving them Japan this bargaining chip? What does Russia get out of it? Do you think he's just a nice guy and going to return territory to Japan? Or does he need Japan for something?
Right. What do you think that he needs Japan for? What do you think is going on there? Because I remember that a story that just happened maybe a month or two ago.
Well, I think they're going to open up the doors for Russian Siberian gas and oil to Japan. Because they didn't have the capacity before. Almost all of Russia is on the western side of Russia, right? And most of the Soviet states underneath Russia, their pipelines all go north. They don't go east-west. They go up until they connect to Moscow. They go up and left, And Siberia has always been this sort of just a place where there's resources and a few railroads shipping everything west, right? And they've realized, because Japan was destroyed in World War II, it quickly rebuilt to a larger economy than any country in Europe. Actually, the third largest in the world, only behind the United States and China, which is the first and third largest population on Earth. So Japan, for having something the size of California to be the third wealthiest nation on Earth, they're doing pretty well. And the problem has always been transit. But Russia now with these lines, because U.S. retarded policy on Iran basically pushed China into Russia's arms and made it lucrative enough to spend the billions you need to spend on infrastructure to send oil to China. It's not a large step to connect that and hit Hokkaido in Japan. And Japan has no fossil fuels. They import 99% of their coal, oil, and natural gas outside of Japan. But one thing Japan does have is endless amounts of rare earth metals. Used to be China had the monopoly. Now only two countries have them, three: Mongolia, China, and Japan. But Japan now has the largest deposit, basically endless, that they discovered underwater. And everybody needs those. So that could be also an incentive to warm up to the Japanese, because while China had monopoly, whenever you have a monopoly on anything, you can charge whatever you want. Now they have a competitor. And it's Japan. The poetic justice is hilarious. Of all the people to discover rare earth metals and undermine the Chinese monopoly, I'm sure they're pretty angry that it ended up being Japan.
I'd say. And just for those who are listening who don't think that censorship exists in the United States, you should take a look at Ryan's story and what he's been through lately.
Isn't that something that I'm looking for servers and platforms and payment processors outside of the United States so that I can talk.
Right. And you have to go to Russia and Iran to be able to talk as well.
Yeah, or like Malaysia or some place that doesn't care. And Europe's even worse. Like, I just had 12 videos put on restrictive access on YouTube in the past few days. And they're banned completely in the European Union. Like aside from like
Jeez.
Norway, Iceland, like you cannot watch a lot of my YouTube videos in Europe. You're just not allowed to. I'm like,
What a
why?
bastion of freedom.
Yeah, I'm like,
Yeah.
what's so dangerous? You don't want them to hear about Ukraine? Is that what it is? Like, what is it? But they just don't have freedom of speech there.
Yeah.
You're just not allowed to talk about certain things.
Speaking of Iranian TV, just to back up a little bit, why have you ever been on their show, The Debate? I always wondered why you weren't on there.
I think it's because I'm not Muslim. Honestly, I got offered that in the beginning because they're like, we want you to do a few shows and then go straight to the debate because you can have like 30 minutes to just rail somebody. Yeah. And, I've been on hundreds of shows now and still never been on the debate. But I think my being an atheist is just incompatible in Iran. I think that's what it is.
Okay.
Even though I never talk about that, like a lot of people don't even know what my religion is or isn't, but yeah, I'm not one of these people that bash religion. I think believe whatever works for you.
I would say The Debate is the best foreign policy show in the English language in the world, from what I've seen. So I was always wondering why you weren't on there. But okay,
I had
anyway.
Peter Lavelle on my show a few times from Crosstalk, but I didn't get to go on Crosstalk. It was the other way. He came on mine a few times, but I didn't go there. And that was because this guy, Adam Holland, put a hit piece on me accusing me of being a Holocaust denier and some other nasty things. And this guy, he wrote the similar stuff. He's saying Ron Paul is a racist because of newsletters, or Glenn Greenwald, or Max Blumenthal, Scott Horton, all these anti-war people that are against, who aren't Russophobes, right? That's who he attacks. And the thing is, when you're accused of something like Holocaust denial, like you might as well be accused of like raping a baby or something, because even if you're completely exonerated, like the accusation alone wrecks your reputation, right? Because Google, the SPLC and ADL and all, they're all going to link this article so it comes to the top of Google. And, and I can counter every point, but I can never disseminate the counter as large as the accusation, right? And there have been many shows that have, oh yeah, we like your analysis, and they Google my name and they go to his article like, oh my God, did you say Auschwitz didn't have gas chambers? Rah, rah, rah. Said no. It's just what you read that on the internet. Right. But it's this guy Adam Holland, and I'd sue him if I had enough money, but because it's defamation, plain and simple. And it's degrees of Kevin Bacon stuff. Like he said, I had David Cole on my show. I said, yeah, I had David Cole on my show in 2014. He was a revisionist in the 90s. He changed his mind. Then I had him on my show. What's nuance matter? And I don't think you should censor that either. Like I don't care what someone thinks about World War II. Everybody should have free speech, but you don't, and I hate that groups just get demonized outright for a historical opinion, because it's a slippery slope. Like I could disagree with, someone's views on the Holocaust or whatever, or lack of Holocaust, I mean, but I know people that wouldn't want me to talk about the American Civil War, and I do not think that was a war about slavery, and I can explain why and all. But there are people who I could say, hey, let's censor that too. You can't talk about the Civil War unless you say, Lincoln is some hero and it was all about freeing the slaves and some, feel good fairy tale version of what really went down. And so that's why I support dissidents. Even the dissidents I don't agree with, I support their right to say it, because what if I'm wrong and they're right? You should always let all voices be heard. I don't see any danger in that. If somebody says something ridiculous, people will know it's ridiculous. If someone wants to say there was no moon landing or something, let them. Let the evidence destroy their argument. Don't just censor people. Because who decides what gets censored and what doesn't, right? It's too much of a slippery slope. So I'm all for hearing opinions you don't like. You should be an adult and deal with it. Just be offended. So what?
Well, who decides it should be the truth? It's the Atlantic Council with Facebook, right?
Yes, and they're using hate speech as a pretext to just get rid of speech they don't like. And I can see it reaching a point where they're going to decide that opposing illegal migrants is hate speech, because they've been trying for years now to conflate opposition to illegal immigration with xenophobia or racism or whatever. And then you get these toxic pariahs, I'm not going to name any names, who actually are racist, xenophobic assholes, who hog all the cameras, right? They go straight to that because that's clickbait. Oh my gosh, he's literally Hitler or whatever. And they are helping the other side make a case to where to try and make it appear as if those who are opposing migrants are doing so on some sort of racial prejudice, rather than understanding the economic fallout that comes from importing the third world.
Right. Okay, Ryan, I know I've taken a lot of your time. I was just going to throw in one more question if I could. Close it out. What would you say has been the role of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter and the father of MSNBC's woeful Mika Brzezinski, in the creation of modern Islamic terrorism when he armed and funded the Mujahideen in the 1970s in order to lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan?
Brzezinski did that through the 70s and 80s, and it's interesting because out of the Mujahideen, you end up with Al-Qaeda, just a bunch of foreign diaspora in Afghanistan. And that's a long story that I've put in great detail in this film called The Empire Unmasked, which goes basically through the from the Mujahideen and Iran-Contra, which kind of happened simultaneously, right, in the beginning of the 1980 onward, 79, the creation of BCCI, all that, on into Al-Qaeda during 9/11 and Al-Qaeda after 9/11, which were being aided in Syria. So, I mean, I show the events where we're aiding Al-Qaeda before 9/11, we're aiding Al-Qaeda after 9/11, but we want to pretend like during 9/11 there was completely no relationship between them and the CIA, etc., which is laughably stupid. And I made this film to kind of counteract the plethora of stupidity that is out there about September 11th, which I don't know why this particular event, but it's gotten so goofy, saying they're laser beams or DEW weapons or holograms, or there's no airplanes, or people are still alive, or a missile hit this, or a pod hit this, and physics, thermite, and just ignoring an overwhelming mountain of evidence about a jointly conducted covert intelligence operation, just like Iran-Contra. If you remember, Israel and the United States worked on Iran-Contra together, moving contraband in Iran, not only that, but narcotics out of Nicaragua, to secretly finance both a pilot training program as well as arms smuggling for the Contras to kill the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and 30,000 people died. This lasted for 6 years. And this is something that Reagan and all the politicians publicly denounced and privately supported behind closed doors. And that's a bit how Al-Qaeda works. Or look at Syria. Publicly, ISIS is bad, Al-Qaeda is bad. And then privately, we basically handed Libya over to Al-Qaeda and tried to hand Syria over to Al-Qaeda. And why? Like, who's the prime mover in this? The Zionists. And so I have a film called The Empire Unmasked that really unpacks the whole thing. It's 5 hours long, but it would take you a decade to gather all this information, and you can get it in 5 hours instead. Actually, it's 4 hours and 58 minutes, so a little bit under 5. But
where can people get that?
If you could get one film, that's the one I would get. It's at ancreport.com, and then there's a tab on the top that says films, and I think it's the top film. And there's one under it called Decades of Deception, which goes over 50 years of CIA buffoonery, ending with the end of the Korean War through Operation Ajax, Gladio, etc. I kind of skipped Vietnam because I felt like that's almost a topic into itself. But, right. Gulf of Tonkin's in there. That's interesting, too. The Gulf of Tonkin didn't happen. We had signal intelligence verify that in early 2000s after 2 million Vietnamese people were murdered and untold numbers of Cambodians and people from Laos. but there was a ship that was attacked, the USS Liberty. Johnson covers that up, a real attack where American sailors are murdered, and then invents an attack that didn't happen with the Gulf of Tonkin that's blamed on the Vietnamese, and then millions of them are murdered. Right. So, as you know, Gulf of Tonkin was a lie. The USS Liberty was a cover-up. The only people that attacked a U.S. ship in the 60s were the Israelis. But, of course, LBJ wanted none of that. He never would have been president if they hadn't killed JFK in the first place. I'm working on a film.
Ryan Dawson. Yes, you are. And I've been, I've heard
there is a bit of JFK stuff in Decades of Deception. I went over Robert Kennedy's murder and some things in that film, but it's more just the bullet points. And I know people are like, ooh, how do you know that? Or, but if I had dwelled on, it's kind of a timeline, right? If I had dwelled on 63 for too long, then it would have just been a 20-hour movie or something. I just wanted to make a timeline of like different operations and what they really did, and all the ones that have already been admitted, right? Like Operation Car Wash and things that maybe our wash tub. I mean, car wash is in Brazil. Sorry, that wasn't one of, but these things, I think some are known and some are lesser known, and they're all in that film, and it's only an hour long, and I think it's I wanted it to fit. It's so that like a high school history class could pop it in. It's like 58 minutes or something. And I tried to squish it down on purpose so that it could be good for classrooms. And it's very just dry, this year, this happened, and here's the truth type of stuff. But if you want to deep dive into a particular topic, then Empire en Masse is the one to get. And if you don't have any money, you can always watch War by Deception. If you type War by Deception in YouTube, you can watch that for free. And I made that over 10 years ago, but it's still pretty eye-opening.
Ryan Dawson, thank you for being on Poland News and Foreign Policy Matters.
Thank you so much. And steadfast to Poland, I stand with you guys.